Germanwings Flight 9525. Flight 9525 took off like any other journey on March 24, 2015, but it ended in screams as the jet hurtled toward the ground. The Airbus A320 had just taken off from Barcelona on its way to Dusseldorf, with 150 people on board. Everything seemed routine, the engines humming, the plane climbing, passengers settling in for the short trip. But mid-flight, something went horribly wrong. From cruising height, the jet suddenly began a steep, uncontrolled dive. For nearly 10 minutes, it dropped thousands of feet every minute, racing toward the French Alps. Air traffic control attempted to contact the pilots, and a French fighter jet was even dispatched. But then radar contact was lost. Moments later, a seismic tremor recorded the impact. The aircraft was gone. The final moments were chilling. Inside the cockpit, the recorder picked up nothing but the co-pilot's steady breathing. Outside, the captain was locked out, pounding on the reinforced door, shouting desperately to be let in. Seconds later, it tore into the French Alps at over 430 miles per hour, obliterated on impact. When investigators pieced the evidence together, the truth was shocking. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, had locked the captain out and programmed the plane into a fatal descent. Medical records later revealed he'd been struggling with severe mental health issues, including suicidal thoughts, but kept it hidden from his airline. His internet searches showed chilling preparation, researching suicide methods and the mechanics of cockpit doors just days before the crash. This tragedy shocked the world. Aviation rules quickly changed, requiring at least 2 crew members to be in the cockpit at all times. Airlines also tightened mental health checks, though not without debate. Families of the victims fought for justice while carrying a grief too heavy to put into words. But this wasn't the first time. Just 2 years earlier, another crash had destroyed 25 families, for the very same reason. Mozambique Airlines Flight 470. The moment flight TM470 leveled off in the sky on the 29th of November 2013, its fate was already sealed. The Embraer 190 was nearly brand new, barely a year old, freshly inspected the day before, and carrying 27 passengers and 6 crew on what should have been a short, routine trip from Maputo to Luanda. At first, everything looked normal. The jet climbed smoothly to 38,000 feet, cruising over southern Africa as if nothing could go wrong. But then, without warning, the plane started a terrifying dive through heavy rain over Namibia. Radar showed it plunging at nearly 1,000 feet every 10 seconds, dropping lower and lower until it disappeared from the screens at just 3,000 feet above sea level. Moments later, the jet slammed into Bwabwata National Park. The explosion left no survivors. When investigators recovered the black boxes, the truth they found was chilling. The captain had taken control of the autopilot and forced the descent step by step, while locking the co-pilot out of the cockpit. Warning alarms blared as the co-pilot pounded on the reinforced door. But there was no way back in. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered a heartbreaking picture. The captain was dealing with immense personal struggles, including his son's suicide, his daughter's hospitalization, and a bitter divorce. The final report concluded it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act. Some experts questioned the findings at first, suggesting the inputs could have matched emergency procedures. But the evidence left little doubt. The disaster raised urgent questions about pilot mental health and cockpit access, reminding the world that sometimes the greatest threat to a flight isn't mechanical failure, but the person at the controls. China Eastern Airlines Flight 5735, 291 seconds. That's all it took for a routine flight to turn into a nightmare. On March 21st, 2022, China Eastern Flight 5735 left Kunming for Guangzhou, a short hop flown daily by countless airlines. On board the Boeing 737-800 were 123 passengers and 9 crew, sitting comfortably as the jet cruised at 29,000 feet. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The plane suddenly pitched down and began a terrifying dive. From the ground, witnesses caught video of the jet dropping almost straight down, nose first, before slamming into the mountains of Guangxi province. The impact was violent, leaving no survivors. All 132 lives were lost in seconds. Investigators soon recovered the black boxes, though the wreckage was scattered across rugged terrain. Analysis in China and the US showed no sign of engine failure, bad weather, or crew communication problems. Everything looked normal until the dive began. That's when suspicion grew. US sources later revealed the flight data suggested the controls had been pushed intentionally, raising chilling questions about what happened inside the cockpit. To this day, answers remain scarce. China's aviation authority has released only limited updates despite international guidelines that call for annual reports. 3 years on, families and aviation experts are still left waiting, their grief compounded by silence. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, a modern jet, 239 people, and a flight that never arrived. Was it a disappearance or deliberate diversion? Even after a decade, MH370 remains the greatest mystery in aviation. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. The Boeing 777-200ER, tail number 9 MMRO, carried 227 passengers and 12 crew on what should have been a routine overnight flight. For the first 40 minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then, suddenly, the transponder went silent. The plane slipped off civilian radar without a word. But military data later revealed something even stranger. The aircraft turned sharply west, crossed the Malay Peninsula, and kept flying over the Andaman Sea, far from its intended path. There were no signals, no distress calls, only a calculated detour into the unknown. Hours later, fuel would have run dry, and the jet was presumed to have crashed deep in the southern Indian Ocean. But with no distress beacon and no immediate wreckage, the world was left with silence. Over the years, only a handful of fragments washed up on distant beaches, 3 confirmed to be part of MH370. The rest of the plane remains missing. Investigators pored over satellite signals and radar logs. Their conclusion was unsettling. The diversion likely came from manual inputs, not a technical failure. Flight simulators confirmed it too. The turn-back maneuvers matched deliberate control. The transponder and data link had been shut down in sequence, suggesting not a malfunction, but intent. Actions only someone trained, like a pilot, could carry out. Theories exploded: hijacking, mechanical breakdown, or the unthinkable, like pilot suicide. Political plots were even whispered. Yet after years of searching and the most expensive investigation in aviation history, no final answer has ever been found. The disappearance of MH370 forced regulators to change how planes are tracked, demanding stronger satellite monitoring and flight data that can't simply vanish. But for the families of the 239 people on board, those changes came too late. MH370 showed us how an entire jetliner could vanish without answers. But long before that, another case had already raised disturbing questions, not about disappearance, but about a cockpit struggle, where the truth itself became a battleground. EgyptAir Flight 990. 33 minutes into its Atlantic crossing, EgyptAir Flight 990, carrying 217 passengers, made a sudden and unexplainable descent, one that would spark decades of controversy. It was Halloween night in 1999, and the Boeing 767-300ER, named Thutmose III, had just left Los Angeles, stopped in New York to refuel and change crews, and was now bound for Cairo. On board were families, tourists, and military officers, all settling into what seemed like a perfectly ordinary flight, unaware that disaster was already written into its path. At cruising altitude, everything appeared routine until the relief first officer quietly spoke the words, "I rely on God." He disconnected the autopilot, pushed the throttles to idle, and sent the jet into a steep dive. Passengers felt weightless as gravity seemed to disappear. The captain, just returning from the lavatory, rushed back into the cockpit, shouting in disbelief at what was happening. But the dive only grew steeper. Both engines were shut down, alarms blared, and within seconds, the flight recorders captured their final data. The jet broke apart under immense stress and plunged nose first into the Atlantic Ocean at terrifying speed. All 217 lives were lost. Investigators recovered the recorders quickly and launched a joint probe. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board determined the relief first officer had deliberately forced the jet down while the captain fought desperately to regain control. Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority rejected that finding, arguing a mechanical failure in the elevator power control unit was to blame. U.S. investigators dismissed that theory, fueling a bitter dispute. Speculation only grew when a fellow pilot alleged that the first officer had brought the plane down in revenge against an executive on board, though this was never proven. To this day, EgyptAir Flight 990 is one of aviation's darkest mysteries, its truth caught between tragedy, suspicion, and denial. SilkAir Flight 185. The calm skies over Indonesia were shattered when a Boeing 737 suddenly dove toward the Musi River with terrifying speed. Just moments earlier, that same jet, almost brand new, had been cruising smoothly as SilkAir Flight 185, a short journey from Jakarta to Singapore on December 19, 1997. On board were 97 passengers and 7 crew, expecting nothing more than an easy 80-minute journey to Changi Airport. At first, everything looked routine. Then, without any warning, the cockpit voice recorder went dead. A few minutes later, the flight data recorder followed. Radar showed the jet cruising steadily at 35,000 feet until it suddenly pitched nose first into a dive. In just seconds, SilkAir Flight 185 tore into the Musi River near Palembang, breaking apart on impact and taking all 104 lives with it. What followed only deepened the mystery. Indonesia's NTSC couldn't find enough proof to blame either mechanical failure or intentional action. But US investigators at the NTSB saw it differently. They found evidence that the nose was held down by sustained control inputs. The recorders were shut off midair, and no attempt was made to pull the jet out of the dive. To them, it looked less like a failure and more like a deliberate act by the captain. Years later, a US court reached a different conclusion, blaming a faulty rudder power control unit and ordering the manufacturer to pay millions in damages. In the end, two explanations stood side by side: pilot suicide or mechanical failure, and neither has ever been accepted as the final truth. To this day, SilkAir Flight 185 sits in the shadowy space between fact and speculation, a flight silenced midair, its recorders erased, and its truth still out of reach. Royal Air Maroc Flight 630. Minutes after takeoff, a plane carrying dozens of passengers suddenly nosed down toward the rugged Atlas Mountains. There was no distress call or a sign of trouble, but only silence before it shattered on impact. It was August 21st, 1994. Royal Air Maroc Flight 630 had just left Agadir for what should have been a short, routine hop to Casablanca. The aircraft, an ATR-42 turboprop with 44 people on board, was expected to be in the air for less than an hour. Instead, it was gone in 10 minutes. At first, the climb looked normal. Then, without warning, the captain, Yunus Kayati, disengaged the autopilot. The plane dropped into a steep, unstoppable dive, tearing through the skies until it slammed into the ground near Dawar Izunin, 20 miles north of Agadir. Everyone on board was killed instantly. Investigators later revealed the horrifying truth. The descent wasn't caused by weather or mechanical failure. It was deliberate. Evidence showed the autopilot had been manually disconnected and the controls pushed forward. The first officer's desperate calls for help were captured, but there was no recovery. The Moroccan Pilots Union pushed back, insisting the captain showed no signs of instability and suggesting a technical malfunction. Yet no such fault was ever found. The crash stood as the deadliest ATR-42 accident of its time and left Morocco's aviation world shaken. It exposed an uncomfortable reality that sometimes the greatest danger isn't mechanical failure, but human intent. Japan Airlines Flight 350. No one on board Japan Airlines Flight 350 could have imagined that a short flight to Tokyo's Haneda Airport would end as one of the darkest days in Japan's aviation history. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-8, flying from Fukuoka on February 9, 1982. On board were 166 passengers and 8 crew. Everything about the journey seemed routine until the final moments, when routine turned to tragedy. As the aircraft lined up for landing, the captain suddenly disconnected the autopilot. He pulled the throttles back, pushed the control column forward, and even deployed thrust reversers while still in the air. Something that should never happen. The first officer and flight engineer fought to pull the nose back up, but the jet kept sinking. Within seconds, the DC-8 slammed into the shallow waters of Tokyo Bay, just short of the runway. The cockpit tore away from the fuselage and slid forward. Out of 174 people on board, 24 lost their lives. When investigators pieced together the evidence, it was revealed that the captain had forced the plane down on purpose. The thing that's even more disturbing is that after the crash, he climbed into a rescue boat and pretended to be an office worker, hiding his identity. Later, doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The disaster exposed huge cracks in the system. How could a pilot with such a serious mental illness have passed medical exams without detection? Why weren't safeguards in place to prevent one person from having total control in the cockpit? Japan Airlines Flight 350 showed how danger could come from a pilot in command. But just 5 years later, another case would show that the threat didn't always sit at the controls. Sometimes it walked on board with a boarding pass. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771. The plane involved in the accident was a British Aerospace 146-200AA, tail number N350PS, nicknamed the Smile of Stockton. On December 7, 1987, it was flying PSA Flight 1771 from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Just 38 passengers and 5 crew on a short commuter run, ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. What no one knew was that a former US Air employee, David Burke, had boarded the flight. He'd been fired and still carried a badge that let him slip past security. Hidden in his pocket was a .44 Magnum revolver. Minutes after takeoff, Burke dropped a note on his supervisor's seat, the man he blamed for losing his job. Then he pulled the trigger. 2 shots rang out in the cabin. A desperate radio call from the cockpit confirmed the nightmare, saying, "Gunfire on board." 10 seconds later, silence. The pilots were gone. The jet plunged from 22,000 feet, screaming toward the hills of San Luis Obispo County. Engines roared in a final dive before it slammed into the ground at near supersonic speed. The impact was total. All 43 lives were lost instantly. When investigators combed through the wreckage, they found that chilling note Burke had left on the seat. In it, he mocked him, saying it was ironic they both ended up dead, and cruelly added that Thompson's family would get nothing from his life insurance. They also recovered Burke's revolver with 6 empty shells and even a fragment of his fingertip jammed in the trigger. For investigators, the evidence was undeniable that this was a revenge-fueled cockpit murder-suicide. The crash of PSA Flight 1771 wasn't just another tragedy. It exposed how fragile aviation security really was. At the time, fired employees could still walk past checkpoints, badges unchecked. That loophole ended with this disaster. New rules required immediate deactivation of credentials and stricter screening for all airline staff. In the end, this tragedy proved that the deadliest threats can sometimes come from within the system itself.